Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Today's webinar by the FreeMind group is going to be on the topic of non-dilutive funding opportunities in oncology, specifically focusing primarily on some of the larger targets that are broader in terms of the spectrum of approaches and indications within oncology that they fund. There will be things we cannot cover here. We're trying to keep this in a manageable time frame, but obviously happy to discuss more specific sources of funding, private foundations, things like that that could be relevant if anybody's interested as well. So my name is Jonathan Adalist. I'm head of business development at the FreeMind Group, and basically let's dive in. So in general, non-dilutive funding can be used to cover the entire R&D process, moving all the way into phase 3 clinical trials in some spaces. Honestly, in oncology, that's not necessarily the case. Generally, it ends a little bit earlier than that in oncology. Phase 2 is still definitely realistic, or at least a portion of a phase 2, depending on how cost effective it is. But there are definitely other spaces where phase 3 is absolutely realistic as well. It doesn't have to be the Moderna $470 million grant in COVID. There are other more realistic sized ones as well in different spaces. But regardless, it's a source of funding that we at FreeMind focus on, obviously, as the primary source of funding we help companies access. And as indicated here, it really can be a tool that you leverage throughout most of the development process. Focusing today on oncology, we're going to talk mainly about two sources of funding. As I mentioned, we can't cover everything that's possible here, but the main goal from my perspective was to emphasize that even with everything that's going on right now, there still are funders, and many of them, that while COVID is incredibly important and it's, taken over significant aspects of all of our lives, really, the funders realize there are other issues, and cancer is not going away because COVID is around, and things are moving forward in that space. I know a lot of companies are pivoting and trying to address COVID, and there's nothing wrong with that. But there's funding out there, as there always was, and as there will be moving forward, for all of the non-COVID indications and spaces as well. Oncology is one of the major ones, and that's really what we're going to dive into today. So you can't discuss oncology funding, or rather non-dilutive funding in oncology, without starting with the NCI, the National Cancer Institute. The National Cancer Institute is the federal agency, the principal federal agency charged with advancing research in oncology. Their mission is to lead, conduct, and support cancer research across the nation to advance scientific knowledge and to help all people live together longer, healthier lives. And basically, the way it really shapes up in terms of the budget is currently the NCI's budget. Well, this is actually not exactly the NCI budget. This is the National Cancer Institute's spending in oncology, which includes some funding that comes in through non-NCI sources, but the vast majority, I believe, of the current about $7.2 billion a year that the NIH is devoting to cancer, over 6.5 of the 7.2 is through the NCI. So basically any oncology-related project is probably going to be funded within the NIH by the NCI. There are some very specific, either the NICHD could, in some cases for pediatric cancers, NIBIB if it's very kind of technology oriented or a platform or diagnostics sometimes in specific aspects of the project, things like that. But the vast majority of this is coming through the NCI. And you can see also over the years, and this is just the last 5 years, the budget has gone up significantly by $1.5 billion. So we're talking about a very significant uptake per year in funding. It's obviously a very pressing issue. I'm assuming because you're attending this webinar, this is a space you're familiar with and engaged in research in. So clearly I don't have to sell you on the unmet medical needs that exist in this space. But the point is, maybe more importantly, that is recognized by the NCI and by the government in general. And this is really kind of zooming into that and looking at spending in specific indications. And there's a very long tail on this. This is definitely not the entire picture of the categorical spending in oncology, but some of the main spaces that are funded. And I broke it down here by year, so you can see that in most spaces, not only are there very significant amounts of funding being allocated by the NCI, but it's also increasing year to year. Even if you go down the list and look at the cervical cancer, where it's not really increasing year to year, and it looks like a relatively low amount, we're talking about $100 million a year specifically for cervical cancer. If you're in the cervical cancer space and there was a fund out there that only funds cervical cancer, funding $100 million a year, you'd be very excited about that fund. So I think really the point is there is a very significant amount of money being allocated to research in oncology. And as I mentioned, the tail on this graph could hypothetically be very long. Obviously, they cover pretty much any indication in oncology. In general, with the NCI, there are two funding routes that can be used: solicited and unsolicited funding mechanisms. The difference really is solicited funding mechanisms define a specific area of interest or a topic or a type of method, a type of approach that they're looking to fund. And if that is a fit for you, you can search the NIH website for any of the keywords or the terminology that is relevant for what you're trying to do. And if you find something that's relevant for you, that's fantastic. It's both a good way to apply because it's focused on what you do, and it also generally is a good indication that there is genuine interest within, in this case, the NCI, but the NIH in general, in the type of approach you are utilizing. That being said, unsolicited mechanisms are fantastic funding mechanisms, and specifically with the NCI, as indicated here at the bottom of the slide, a very significant portion, most years 60 to 65% of the NCI's funding goes out through these investigator-initiated, unsolicited mechanisms. And just to make sure there's no confusion, the NIH definition of investigator-initiated is very different than the FDA's definition. So this has nothing to do with what the FDA would designate an investigator-initiated trial or anything like that. It's basically something that is initiated by the investigator. The investigator is whoever is submitting the grant. It's as simple as that. Lots of different funding mechanisms. The main ones, specifically in the unsolicited space, are SBIRs and STTRs in the realm of only for small businesses, either specifically for a small business within SBIR or collaboration and kind of a tech transfer between a university and the industry within STTR. But R21s and RONs are fantastic mechanisms, and they can be won by companies as well. Obviously, for academics, it's good. For non-US applicants, they're fantastic sources of funding as well. So there are various different funding routes and funding mechanisms that can be used here. To dive in, we'll start with the SBIRs and STTRs. So and again, to be clear, I'm going to give an overview of the main ways to approach both the NCI and further on also the CDMRPs. I will not be able to cover everything, and I'm happy to discuss things more specifically. And I'll give some examples of the solicited and the more specific and tailored mechanisms as well. But if you're interested in looking for things like that, please, I'll share my contact information at the end of the presentation. Please feel very free to reach out if that's something you're interested in. But circling back to the matter at hand, SBIRs and STTRs are phased. There's a phase 1 and a phase 2. Generally, the phase 1 is for much more early stage preliminary work, and phase 2 is for work that is basically based on the phase 1. It's slightly more advanced. Honestly, it does not have to be terribly advanced to justify phase 2. And there are various ways to manipulate that. You can submit a phase 1, you can submit a phase direct to phase 2, or phase 2 as a continuation of a phase 1. You can submit a fast track that is basically submitting both a phase 1 and a phase 2 at the same time as part of one application, and then eliminating the lag time between the phase 1 and phase 2. As soon as you successfully meet the milestones determined in the phase 1, you automatically proceed to receive the funding from the phase 2. So there are different ways to navigate that. Um, the budgets are up to about $250,000 for a phase 1 and about $1.7 million for a phase 2. About a year ago, they changed those caps, and now I say about because the numbers are inexplicably specific and not round numbers. It's 252,900 and something for a phase 1, and then 1.695. They're very, very specific numbers, but these are more or less the amounts. That being said, in specific topics that honestly in oncology are fairly broad, these caps can be exceeded. That's definitely worth looking at. The scope, first of all, in terms of what they would consider funding, is for SBIRs and STTRs, small businesses in the US. And other than that, it's really very broad. The definition is you must have capabilities and technological expertise that would contribute to the R&D mission of the NCI, which is basically almost anything in oncology. It's very, very broad. And that's why we're looking at it in the context of the unsolicited, kind of the broad funding mechanisms that can be used for any type of research in the space. The deadlines are January, April, and September 5th. When one of those dates falls on a weekend, then it'll be on the following Monday. But those are the basic deadlines. A few noteworthy topics to keep in mind. First of all, there are 2 different solicitations for SBIRs and 2 different solicitations for STTRs. One is for clinical activities, one is for preclinical activities. If you look at the title of the solicitation, one will say clinical, in parentheses, clinical trials not allowed, and the other will say clinical trials required. Just make sure you're using the right one. The current solicitations, if you Google parent NIH SBIR, the solicitation that will come up will expire very soon. The April 5th deadline this year was the last deadline of that solicitation, but it's always continuously renewed and extended. That should be happening soon. The next deadline will be September 5th. And as I gave the example of SBIRs, there are equivalent STTRs as well. The only important thing to keep in mind in that context is an STTR is designed to fund a collaboration between an academic and for-profit business. So it's technologies that are being spun out or transferred from the academic setting into the industry. A portion of the work has to be conducted at the university. Another portion of the work has to be conducted by the company. There are various different specific requirements, both for SBIRs and STTRs. We can dive into that another time. We have quite a few webinars specifically on SBIRs and STTRs and diving in much deeper to the specifics there on our YouTube channel. You're more than welcome to check that out as well. But on a high level, that's basically the difference between the two. And then switching over to the R01s and R21s, the main reason to focus on these would be the lack of SBIR eligibility, to be completely honest. They are slightly more competitive, but they're still very good sources of funding. The R21 is in many ways, not exactly, but in many ways the equivalent of the phase 1, and the R01 the equivalent of phase 2. The budgets are different though. $275,000 for an R01 and no budget cap for an R01. That number also is not including indirect costs. So you can add a percentage on top of that. For a lot of organizations, that would usually, if you don't have a negotiated rate, be, let's say, 25 to 40%. So if you receive X amount of dollars, you'll actually get an additional 25 to 40% on top of that to cover the overhead and indirect costs. R21s are basically geared towards exploratory new research, preliminary work. They don't technically require any preliminary data. We highly advise adding preliminary data, to be very clear, but it's not a requirement. It is actually designed to fund very, very preliminary early work. R1s are for more advanced projects. There's no one way to define the difference between a project that's ready for an R21 or an R01, because in different situations, in different spaces, based on the different types of activities that would be required, there's no definitive guideline. I would say, though, animal data is a good rule of thumb. In terms of deadlines, so the R21s typically have deadlines in February, June, and October, as well as the R01s. The difference would be that the R21s are on the 16th of each one of those months, and the R01s are on the 5th. As mentioned earlier, whenever one of these dates is on a weekend, the deadline will be on the following Monday. Important to mention here, also clinical and preclinical projects to use separate solicitations, specifically the R01, obviously clinical R21s. They do exist actually, but they're few and far between. It's just hard to find clinical activities that cost less than $300,000. But that does actually exist in very specific cases. And also very important to note that the NCI generally do not use the NIH-wide parent R21. They have their own. It's PAR 19356. So just, put that in Google and you'll find it immediately. Essentially identical in the sense that it's very broad. There are no specific scientific guidelines. So it's in essence kind of a parent announcement, even though it is not technically a parent announcement. It's issued specifically by the NCI. That being said, it covers anything within the area of interest of the NCI. So it's kind of their own parent announcement. Moving on to solicited applications or mechanisms within the NCI, there's a very long list. If you go on the NIH website and search for grants, even if you narrow it down to the type of general funding mechanisms that are usually applicable to companies, and narrow it down to only things that are issued by the NCI, I would wager that if you do that, you'll still find between 60 and 70 different specific solicitations right now. So I brought some examples here, but the truth is there's a very, very long list. And these, as you can see here, are quite focused. And as an example, so there's assay validation, and there's early stage development of informatics technologies, innovative molecular analysis technologies. There are the interest here in the third one that I skipped over is for low resource settings. So anything that has that angle could use this funding mechanism. There's obviously microbiome oriented specific solicitations, because that's the topic that's generating a lot of interest right now. Various different approaches. And actually I tried here to give the examples also from different types of funding mechanisms. So you'll notice the first one is a UH2, UH3, which is a non-SBIR but phased mechanism. So there's a UH2 phase and a UH3 phase. The budgets are higher than SBIRs. Usually non-US companies are actually eligible for these, unlike SBIRs. The second example is a U01. It's a fairly large grant, typically no budget cap, can be used to fund clinical trials. The third option and fourth option are both SBIRs. So there's a phase 1 and a phase 2, or a fast track. And budgets, as I mentioned earlier, the fifth one here and the sixth one are both R21. So there's a lot of different funding mechanisms here as well, different specific angles and focus areas. And really, the main point is A, go ahead and search through the website. As I mentioned, there are dozens of them. But B, and this is kind of circling back to what I said earlier, it's actually not that important that you find something that is a good fit. Because if you're in the oncology space and you're doing something that is truly addressing an unmet medical need, your chances are not necessarily lower to receive funding if there's nothing that's tailored to what you're looking to do. Submit through one of the parent mechanisms we mentioned earlier, the unsolicited funding mechanisms. And as I mentioned, 60 to 65% of the funding goes out through those very, very broad mechanisms. There's nothing wrong with that. Do not be deterred if you do not find something like this that is tailored to what you're looking to do. The second source of funding I want to focus on is the Congressionally Directed Medical Research Programs, or the CDMRPs for short, which is not a very short acronym, but it is what it is. CDMRPs are, in general, the way Congress allocates funding through the DoD to fund medical research, kind of general medical research, not always specifically battlefield oriented, but because they're charged with taking care of families of the men and women in uniform, veterans, things like that. They cover a lot of indications that are not your typical DoD funding spaces. And usually the mechanisms they use to do that are the CDMRP. They evolved as a mechanism, as I mentioned, for Congress to appropriate funds for research on specific diseases. They are organized in programs for specific indications. Usually there are some broad programs, but most of the programs are always per indication. The focus areas, do change year to year, but the truth is many of the programs are recurring annually. They're issued once a year. They can change, they do change things from time to time, but most of the programs recur year to year. The review process can be expedited in many cases. And important to mention, there are no geographical restrictions in terms of where the company is based. Canadians can apply, Europeans can apply, anybody can apply. The way generally the CDMRPs work, and there'll be one example that's actually negating what I'm going to say, but they're once a year mechanisms. They're issued usually early in the year. There's a pre-application deadline and a full application deadline. You submit a pre-application on the pre-application deadline, and the full application is upon invitation. So you only submit a full application if you're invited to do so based on your pre-application. Usually pre-application dates are late spring, early summer, and full applications are later in the summer, sometimes in the fall. You'll see the examples I gave in a moment. But the truth is, many of these have already passed in terms of the pre-application dates. So we're going to cover some of the ones that are remaining. The main point, though, is not just to focus on the ones that are still open, but to familiarize you in general with these as a source of funding, because come early 2021, the entire set of CDMRPs will be issued, and obviously there'll be more open than there is right now after many of those deadlines have already passed. So as I mentioned, the first step is a pre-application. Usually that's actually fairly short. Depending on the program, it could be 3 pages or 5 pages, or sometimes even a little bit more than that, but it's fairly concise. It is a very, very important step of the process because most of the applications do not proceed beyond this date. This is the major cutoff. So while it's not a ton of work to put that document together, it's very important to craft it as masterfully as possible towards really being invited to submit that full application. Once, hopefully, it is favorably reviewed and you receive the invitation to submit the full application, you do so. You typically, and you'll see in the examples, this is not always the case, but usually there's a second separate deadline, a couple months at least after the pre-application deadline, to give them time to review and decide. But if you're invited, then you'll have usually about 60, sometimes 90 days to submit the full application, sometimes less, to be honest. And then hopefully they like that and you receive the award. There are different award mechanisms in each program. So as an example, there is a, lung cancer program. Within the lung cancer program, there are a few different types of awards. Within the breast cancer program, there are different types of awards. There are some general award types that they do use in a recurring fashion, so they're worth at least understanding, but it does change indication to indication, mechanism to mechanism. Basically, a discovery or a concept award would typically be very low. And it's for very, very preliminary things, just kind of proof of concept on a very high, even basic in vitro level, things that are they're very, very preliminary. Idea awards can be a little bit larger, but still quite preliminary work. Impact awards are typically larger, about $1 million. They can be at various stages of development, to be honest. The point of an impact award is really something that if you are able to demonstrate what you're trying to demonstrate, they're looking for something that will have a real impact, not another molecule that does something similar to something that already exists or anything like that. Something that would have a real profound impact, and in terms of the stage of development, they're relatively flexible with that type of award. Technology or therapeutic development awards, typically larger. Those are for moving towards the clinic, sometimes even early clinical work, and clinical trial awards can be quite large. As I mentioned, a lot of them are currently not open, but I wanted to bring a few examples of programs that are still open. There are others that are open that I'm not mentioning here. As I mentioned, there's quite a long list of programs in general, and each program has various different award types. But within the breast cancer research program, the BCRP as an example, there are actually 4 award levels. The 3 and 4, so the more advanced projects, actually the deadlines have passed at this point in time for this year. But I'll circle back to that in a moment, because actually this is an example of pretty much the only CDMRP I'm familiar with that doesn't only have one deadline a year. But regardless, the letter of intent is due September 8th. Letter of intent and pre-application are terms that can be used interchangeably. But in this case, it is the example that kind of is the exception to the rule. This is not a competitive pre-application. It's just something you have to do towards submitting. If you'll see the difference in time between the letter of intent and the full application, we're talking about 14 days, 2 weeks. Obviously, that's not enough time to produce a full application. Start working on both in advance. You start with the letter of intent. It's not a competitive phase, and basically everybody submits a full application. That is very rarely the case, but this is one specific CDMRP where that is the case. Level 1 is for very, very early project. The way they define it is research that is in the earliest stages of idea development, or is an untested theory on that level, really. And level 2 is generally for preclinical research. The budget caps are $450 for level 1 and $750 for level 2. And as I alluded to earlier, all 4 levels will have another deadline towards the end of the year, typically in November. Hasn't been issued yet for this year, but usually the time frame for the second breast cancer program deadlines are November. And actually, this is a good example of one of the larger awards, the level 4 breakthrough award. Can get to be a fairly large award. $9 million is not an unrealistic number, as an example. They don't define a specific budget cap. They just say how much money they intend to devote to the awards and how many awardees they anticipate. So it's not necessarily a hard cap, but they can be pretty large. The lung cancer program, some of the deadlines also here have passed, but there's a Clinical Translational Research Partnership Award. And basically, this is a mechanism. The reason there's the word partnership there is because they want you to partner with either a military treatment facility or a VA medical center. They say it's highly encouraged or strongly encouraged. I'll put it differently. You need if you want to apply to this, you should be doing that. It's that simple. Pre-application July 22nd, full application August 5th. Another example, and the reason we're seeing a lot of these where the pre-application is adjacent to the full application and not a competitive stage is because these are the ones that are currently left and not in a situation where the pre-application is passed. So this is just not please don't take this as the standard. This is actually a rarity. Those are the ones that are currently left, but most of the CDMRPs, you'll actually have a competitive pre-application stage that is much more than 2 weeks apart from the full application. This is up to $1.2 million. plus indirect. So actually it could be significantly higher than that, as I mentioned, without a negotiated rate, usually 25, 30, 40% on top of that. So this could easily be 1.6, 1.7 million. Translational studies that include a clinical trial, and that's basically this mechanism, obviously lung cancer. The Melanoma Research Program, they have, one of the deadlines they have left is the IDEA Award, and this, unlike the previous two, is still a competitive phase one. It's just later in the year. Competitive, pre-application, just later in the year. June 22nd for the pre-application, September 24th for the full application, $300,000. And this is, as I mentioned earlier, IDEA Awards are for new ideas, relatively early stage work. The Melanoma Research Program also has other mechanisms, as do the lung cancer and breast cancer program. These are just examples based on the fact that the deadlines are still open this year, and also that, just examples to give you kind of a sense of the different types of awards that are out there. Generally, when you're looking at submitting an award, or really even when you're planning the narrative of the application, it's very important to try to understand what the priorities, what the preferences are within that funding agency, and gear your application to that. All of that being said, there's no point in submitting a grant that'll fund activities that are not really going to advance the company just because there's a grant out there. I'm not saying there's no value in being able to put on the website or mention at conferences that you received a grant. It's great, and especially from the NCI or the DoD, which are very, very credible sources of funding, and there is a lot of validation that comes with that. But at the end of the day, if it's taking you in a direction that's not at least adjacent to your critical path, or if you don't really have the bandwidth to do that and still advance things on your critical path, it's not always really worth it. So gear what you're proposing to what they're looking for, and still make sure you're doing something you really want to do. Know your weaknesses and partner up when necessary. If there's a set of capabilities you don't have in-house, you could collaborate, you could hire someone, you could bring somebody on as a consultant for the specific project. There are various different ways to address that, but they're always looking for all the facets to be covered. And really, that is the way to produce winning awards. At this point, I will go to questions. If you have anything, just add it in the chat. If there's something very, very specific, I'd rather address that by email. But let me just open the chat to see if there are general questions that the answer to them may be interesting for everyone. Okay, can UK come? Yes. With the exception of SBIRs and STTRs, UK companies are definitely eligible for the vast majority of everything I mentioned. Circling back, so all of the CDMRPs UK companies can apply for. The R01s, R21s, UO1s, I'll just go back to the solicitation slide from the NCI here. Here we go. No, missed it. Here we go. So the first two, yes. The third and the fourth, no. The fifth and the sixth, yes, to answer that question more accurately. So as you see, there are things a UK company cannot apply for, but there are more things that you can. And maybe most importantly, the R01 and R21 that are parent announcements, meaning they cover anything in oncology, are open to non-US applicants. So no matter what you do, you can definitely apply, both to the NCI and to the DoD. Second question here is fairly specific. Actually, it is, no, I think there is an interesting answer here. Okay, so a company that was awarded a phase one from the NSF. So the NSF is different to the NIH. I did not mention the NSF here, although there can be NSF awards in oncology. The company would have to be more tech-oriented. The NSF, as the National Science Foundation, they're not a incredibly biology-oriented funder, but they definitely fund projects with biology relevance. It should really be discussed on a case-to-case basis, but it's definitely possible. The reason it's not included here is what I just mentioned, but it's definitely a good funder. So can we apply for a phase 2 from NIH before work on the phase 1 is completed? So to make sure I understand it, the work is non-overlapping. So I'll divide the question into two. Can you move from the NSF phase 1 to the NIH phase 2? Yes. The way to do that is a direct to phase 2. And basically that means based on the data from the phase 1, you're skipping the NIH phase 1 and submitting a phase 2 directly. You can definitely do that. Can you do that in the June timeframe? Well, there's no NIH SBIR deadline in June. The deadline is September. Can you do that in September? Yes, absolutely. The only question there is to justify the direct to phase 2, you would have to provide them with a lot of information. And it doesn't have to be entirely parallel to the NSF phase 1. If you don't have all the data from the NSF phase 1, but you have other data that you can add that would be a parallel to that, because they don't, it's not an official continuation of that grant. You can submit a direct to phase 2 if you've not won any awards in the past, just based on research you conducted, skip the phase 1. So the answer essentially is yes, but it does depend on what data you can send them to justify. I hope that helps. I think that covers it. Please, my contact information is here on the screen. If there are any more specific questions or anything you'd like to ask about some of the funders I didn't discuss, like the NSF or a lot of the private foundations in oncology, things like that that are really more specific, very happy to do so. Just feel free to reach out. And regardless, thank you all for joining. This will be available on our website, on our YouTube channel, and I'll be sharing the slides to anybody that joined via email. So thank you all very much, and I look forward to seeing you in the next webinar. Thank you.